Hi, my name is Dr. Jarvis Watson, and I am the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the School of Visual Arts. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I would like to welcome you to a new video podcast called Diversity in 3D. The 3D stand for Defining and Deconstructing Through Dialogue. The mission of this podcast is to spread awareness, education, and unity through discussions that focus on topics affiliated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a campus, we will be successful in our mission if we are able to identify and address those issues that we do not understand or may find discomforting. Through this video podcast, we will take one of many steps to address these challenges through authentic dialogue and discourse. Throughout the year, we will be interviewing different members of the DEI task force, as well as members of our community, local and large, to discuss various issues in detail. Today, I am happy to have two great and close friends of mine to join us on a second episode of Diversity in 3D, Dr. Georgette Grier-Key and Dr. Zebulon Miletsky. Thank you all for being here. How y'all doing today?
Good.
Glad to be
here.
All right, hey, keep talking. Is everybody at the same time? No, it's a blessing. So let me read off your brief bios, and they have extensive bios. I'll start with Dr. Georgette Grier-Key, who's actually a classmate of mine. Dr. Georgette Grier-Key is the inaugural executive director and chief curator of Eastville Community Historical Society of Sag Harbor, New York, the president of the Association of Suffolk County Historical Societies and cultural partners for Sylvester Manor of Shelter Island. Dr. Grier-Key has been a guest curator at the Suffolk County Historical Society of Riverhead and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. She is one of the most outspoken advocates for the preservation and celebration of Long Island history, with an emphasis on African American, Native American, and mixed heritage historical reconstruction. As a founding member and lead organizer of the Pyrrhus Concert, I say that right? Action Committee.
Yes.
Her work led to the rebuilding of the formerly enslaved Pyrrhus Concert's homestead in Southampton's Village, which I actually saw this weekend. She is also a political science professor at Nassau Community College and president of the Brookhaven NAACP chapter. Am I right? All right.
Yes.
And she does a lot of great advocacy in the neighborhood and in the community. And I'm just really glad to have her on her busy schedule that she's here with us today. So thank you, Dr. Grier-Key. All right.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. Definitely. And we're going to have a good discussion today. Dr. Zebulon Miletsky, another good friend, good colleague, we'll go way back, is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Stony Brook University. His book, Before Busing, Boston's Long Freedom Movement and the Cradle of Liberty, is being published, or where are we to publishing? Are we almost there?
December 2021 comes out, but already available for pre-order.
All right, we're gonna claim that. Dr. Miletsky is an historian specializing in recent African-American history, civil rights and Black power urban history, mixed race and biracial identity, and hip hop studies. His research interests include African Americans in Boston, Northern freedom movements outside of the South, and mixed race history in the U.S. and passing, and the Afro-Latin diaspora. He is the author of numerous articles, reviews, essays, and book chapters, and is currently working on a manuscript on the civil rights movement in Boston. Okay. They are two extremely busy, knowledgeable, community-focused, and advocates for social justice and equity. It's not only a pleasure to have the two of you here today, but also an honor to have you both with me today. So this is definitely something I've been looking forward to, and I'm glad we're here today right now. So Dr. Miletsky, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be in dialogue with both yourself and then Georgette Grier-Key today, because this is when you say people who are doing a major social justice work in the community on Long Island, I think of her. I think of her work and the work of the NAACP chapter. So this is nice. This is an honor indeed, sir. Thank you for having me.
All right. Yeah. So today, no, thank you all. Is like I said, once again, this It's a pleasure and honor to kind of do this type of work, especially with people that you revere and regard as not just colleagues, but also just people that you look to for mentorship and guidance and inspiration. So I'm gonna continue to sing your praises so y'all can really come with the fire today. So today's podcast is entitled Juneteenth, an authentic African American narrative. I wrote a blog last week that it really came out in our summer edition of our online newsletter, SVA Today. I spoke about the significance of Juneteenth and its importance of being, not only recognized as a national holiday, but also respected as, hopefully that it will be recognized as a national holiday, known as a state holiday here, and I believe in Texas. And I just wanted to help people also understand it's not just an American narrative, it's an African American narrative. It just does not speak to the experiences of the historical legacy of African American and Black people in America, but it also shines a light on the institution of slavery that has social, cultural, and economic impacts on this country and the world. For those that are truly unaware or slightly unaware about what Juneteenth is, could one of you begin to explain this holiday to our viewers? Like, what is Juneteenth?
Yeah, I know either of us will do that and can do that and will do that today. Juneteenth is real interesting kind of history of its own. The holiday has an interesting history, and then there's the history itself, Dr. Watson, that you just alluded to. And we all know that you had the Emancipation Proclamation, which was signed into effect by President Abraham Lincoln, written in 1862, went into effect in January 1st, 1863. If you know that history, you know that Emancipation Proclamation freed some enslaved people, but not all enslaved people by any means. In fact, it actually freed relatively few enslaved folks. That has a whole story and reasoning behind it, but essentially it was a war measure, and it shifted the course of the war. But then you got, of course, people will say, well, the 13th Amendment passed, in 1865. That ended slavery as an institution in American life, with some exceptions, with major exceptions. I'm sure we'll come back to that later. And but between those two measures, which should have really just ended slavery completely, it's not until June 19th, 1865, a full 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think 2 months, a few months after the passage of the 13th Amendment, you still have folk in Galveston, Texas, who had not gotten the word, had not reached them. Now, I think there's probably a whole interesting history as to why the word may not have reached them, but in any case, it wasn't until the arrival of General Ranger marching in, I think, 5th Galveston, and making that proclamation. And so in waves, you have folk finding out about this thing called the end of slavery.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Miletsky. And I see, as you said, one portion, I saw Dr. Georgette Grier-Key smile, because you touched on the aspect of there might be some reasons behind that. But I hope that you can kind of maybe in your rendition of that as well, Dr. Grier-Key, that you kind of touch on that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Miletsky touches on a few things that's more historical in nature, and we know we're here to really discuss some other, parameters around Juneteenth. But we do not get into the fact that, a lot of people like to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation as if a certain party was responsible for ending slavery. And we really touch around the margins that you know, we did this. No, we have to remember that the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. It wasn't as there was a consensus that this is the right thing to do, so we're going to do it. And we often forget to talk about the fact that, many of the, newly freed, formerly enslaved African Americans that went over to the other side were considered to be contraband. So as Dr. Miletsky stated, that there was so many different nuances with this new Civil War that people don't understand why there was so many different iterations of the newfound freedom and what that meant, and why there was different measures at different times. And then again, why did it take 2.5 years? The variations was, oh, it was a long journey, or, oh, they wanted to wait for the crop to actually harvest. So they made sure that there was a delayed start. So as you said, Dr. Watson, when you opened up, is that Juneteenth also has social, but it also has economic factors to the actual holiday itself. And then in this state and widely around, people always ask, well, this was a Texas thing, so why do we have to be concerned with it? Well, we know that our people are scattered about. So there are many other traditions that go along with Juneteenth. And I don't want to get into it now. Maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, as Dr. Miletsky said, but the nuances around Juneteenth, the holiday, the social, the economic, all has to do with it. And then the religious traditions as well, surrounding emancipation. So there's so many different things that have to go along with this holiday that are not often taught. And the traditions, I think, really have a lot to do with this holiday.
Now, first of all, thank you all for just laying that foundation and giving us some things that, like, there's some surface information that we know, but there's some things below surface that we kind of definitely get into a little bit in regards to some of those in between conversations that were happening, or these aspects of the society that have been affected by the institution of slavery, but the all deliberate speed, if I can use that term, that people went about, to tell enslaved Africans, like, hey, you're free. And I think the next question actually is connected to what you were saying. So maybe if you could kind of feed off of that to Dr. Grier-Key, because it was like, what is the historical significance as an African American narrative here in America? And one of the things I talked about was that it tended not to be shared, maybe outside of Texas, as much as I would think that maybe like Kwanzaa or Watch Night Service might have been shared a little bit more regularly across the nation. So
yeah, there's been some complicated aspects of that, and I guess maybe just as the word got late to folks, and the word is still getting to folks, about this story in a sense, and it's amazing how that's happening. But the thing that people ought to know is that Texas was the first state to have this as a state holiday, which probably makes sense. And it's been already about 40 years. It was like 1980, I believe, is when Texas actually made it a state holiday. And a lot of that, almost all of that, is due to the work and efforts of people on the ground in and around Galveston, in and around the Gulf Coast region, but also even in Houston and other parts of the state. And I say that to mean that, going back to that question about that narrative that we tell, that, the word got there late, like, was it Pony Express? Like, why did the word, what is the reason that the word is getting there late? And the reason is complicated, but it really has to do with the state of Texas itself. Remember that Texas was Mexico, first of all, one time, and it has a complicated history in and of itself, of statehood, and all that kind of thing. Mexico was basically abolishing slavery, and had abolished it in that area. It wasn't there were efforts to end it. And so this has to do with the Mexican-American War, has to do with Texas and its own formation as a state. And some people may realize that or know that Texas was intent and keen on continuing slavery, on first of all being a slave state, right? But then also maybe continuing it. And this is a history that a lot of people don't know that much about. There were ideas about extending slavery, like the global, what we call the globe, the South, meaning into South America, Caribbean, and all that, because knowing that the abolitionist movement in the United States, slavery was, had its days were numbered. So if that makes sense, so there's a clue there. There's a clue there about a desire to extend slavery, and maybe we don't know all the details, but it could help to answer the question of why. But anyway, generations of folks, the ancestors of those enslaved in Galveston, who got the word from General Gordon Granger, the announcement, for generations now have been trying to get this day, June 19th, that is very special to them, to be recognized as something special to all African Americans and all people who, especially those whose ancestors were enslaved in this country. So that's an important history. So by supporting it, we're supporting them. We're supporting Texas, and we're supporting what it means for Black folk in Texas, a state that had not only was intent on having slavery, but possibly of extending slavery, and had some very, very strong, put it mildly, strong ideas on race and on questions of slavery. And that has to do with the history of the state itself. If that makes sense.
No, makes a lot of sense. And yeah, Georgia, if you can kind of extend or add to or elaborate some additional points, that would be great. Yeah.
Well, I agree that Texas was an annex, and that it was, originally the territory of Mexico. And one of the things is, as new states were admitted into, the country, that it was an argument of which states would be entered in, as free or, a state of slavery. So I do think that there was some intention to, of course, or there was, a side that did not want to admit states that would be slave states. And on the other side, they wanted to have states that would continue on to have slavery. And so there was, of course, but then you have people that will argue, or, was the Civil War about slavery, or wasn't? Well, we'll let that go for another debate, but there definitely was this debate about that, and we're not going to get into that here. So, Dr. Miletsky makes a point there, and had not, there was a winner or loser in this situation, we'll never know how this would have ended, but there was a winner. And so with the winner, we see the end result. And then we also see the pushback going further with the Reconstruction, the first, second, and third. So we understand what the intent was. So I agree with Dr. Miletsky on that point. However, I will say that was there a delay? Was there a disconnect in the people? If that is in fact true, will we have the comments that we have for what to a slave is July 1st if there was no connection in the people? Would we not have the comments of commonality in the alternative calendar among Black folks? Even till today, we have an alternative calendar with all of the holidays that we celebrate around emancipation for Jamaica, for Haiti, or whatever, even in this country. If we never had an alternative calendar, given our present time, when we talk about when people ask us, Why are they over in other countries celebrating and protesting things like George Floyd? Because wherever there is an injustice, there is an injustice here. We're not free until all of us is free. Where do you think that these statements come from? So I would have a little bit of a pushback and say that this is not an isolated idea, that there is an alternative and ultimate connection to our people that have survived from the fact that we were brought over here as involuntary immigrants in chains to this country, and that we've maintained our connection throughout the existence of time, and our alternative existence in being in connective relationship has remained. So while it may seem as if we weren't connected to one another from Texas, I would interject that we did. And that's my only significance that I would like to add to that.
One of your perspective, how do you think the atmosphere or the environment was like when Juneteenth happened? You know, what were the thoughts of African American or African freed enslaved Africans during that particular time when someone tells you that you were free?
Yeah. Well, it's always hard to know people, like what might be going through people's heads and stuff at the time, but I can imagine that it was complicated, in quite a calamitous kind of time, because those are months lost. So like sometimes people say, well, like, what's the big thing? A few months. Those are months lost of doing what most folks did, I think, when they heard about either emancipation or free, is go and look for relatives and stuff. Go and look for your wife who was sold, to the neighboring or distant plantation. Go and look for your husband. Go and look for your own children. In some cases, so those are 2 or 3 months lost right there. That people could make great use of, and people's health was probably not altogether. There's all kinds of, to put it mildly, that's a chance to reconstitute one's life a little bit. And we know from the record that's what a lot of people do and did. Slavery was pretty new institution in Texas. I'm trying to say before, like, and so it was different. It was harsher in many cases, and it was one, as one can probably imagine, being that it was a sort of a different, because it was different and somewhat newer and all that kind of thing. I don't know if that doesn't make it better. I think if anything, it would make it worse. And so those are the testimonials and the stories that come from Texas. Don't forget about Jasper, Texas, in the 1990s, where a man was dragged to death. A black man was dragged to death and decapitated. Texas, it's a different space, and I haven't spent too much time there, so I can't speak to it like that much. But comparatively, we know that, as Dr. Grier-Key mentioned, each state did things differently. Slavery in North Carolina is different from slavery in Maryland, is different from slavery in Florida, is different from slavery in Texas. Different reasons for that, just different things. White supremacy kind of constant, but some they do it differently regionally. And so yeah. So I would say that it was it's one of jubilation, and it's a day of jubilee, and to be sure, and one to be celebrated. That's the whole point. But it's time lost. It's a great injustice, and it was I don't know if it's as like benign as just not getting the word right away. I think it might be a little bit. There may be some bureaucrat, and whatever resistance that is as was said before, it's not from the people. It's not from persons. It's not the people. It's from top down. As you were saying before, in terms of the only thing that that made people strong was that network of the grapevine or whatever, of getting the word. And so I would imagine people got the word in many different ways once we break it down. But that's it, it's solidarity and showing solidarity with that struggle. Now, people also need to know, though, that Juneteenth is not the oldest celebration of emancipation of the country. In fact, it's really the last, by definition, the latest, right? And you have slavery being ended in the northern states, in the Northeast, in New England, just earlier, mostly around the time right after the American Revolution, in most cases, although as late as 1827 in New York, and then also late in New Jersey. But for that simple reason of this having happened earlier, people have been celebrating Emancipation Days and celebrations of that for a long time in the Northeast and North. In Washington, D.C. has its own day when they celebrate Emancipation Day, which is a different time. So they had, and many states along the eastern seaboard celebrate it on different days.
Thank you, Doc. Yeah. Dr. Grier-Key, did you want to add? Or?
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that too, but I do think that, again, in regards to specifically, I do think that we have seen from the records various ways that celebrations actually happened. And though I do think that there was worry on what this new freedom would mean, you see that in the records as well, because there is an economic aspect to what this new freedom mean, and what does it mean for us? Where do we go from here? And I would like to say that, if you think about this, it's just like you being on a race. And not just because I read the book, but this is a great way to, and I moderated with Don Lemon on his new book, This is the Fire. And you think about it, like he said, it's the ready, set, go. So it's like being in a race, and they have 2.5 years head start on how to turn this thing, around. Like we gave you your freedom, but now I got a 2.5 year head start on how to make you miserable with this thing. So, just think about it. So how are you, who have been on a plantation for generations, gonna come out of this? So we know, and again, to me as a historian and a preservationist, I think it's important what I always do, because students, they're going to get bored. So I always bring the historical into the present now on multiple levels. So in fact, we know from this process how we now come to tenement farming, to what we now has the convict, the convict system, to now our current penitentiary system. Because now think about what happens. How in the world are you going to be able to, fend for your family, etc.? So we see immediately that this system is going to be put into place. And this is a result of this 2.5 year start. So yes, we have some positive things that come out of it, because the traditions, this is why there was a delay in telling them who is going to harvest this. Many of the people did not know how to farm. And in these places, on these regions, the enslavers, the planters, were completely outnumbered by the enslaved folks. If you look at the census records, they'll tell you that. So there's no way that they would be able to harvest this. And as soon as slavery was ended in these regions, the economies sank completely. Many of them left their areas and left their plantations and their land. So we know this from the records. So again, these people were left there. They were more than likely assigned the land. They took care of the land. And then immediately what happens, my father would say the Dixiecrats, they now will be able to have an unnecessary condition that, okay, you're signed over, you're now going to join, we're going to be one union, one country, you're going to sign a paper, you're going to be with us now, okay, we'll give you your land back after you lost. So there was an unnecessary compromise. They got their land back, and they go back, and now the people who are there tending to everything got nothing. We never got our 40 acres and a mule, and you're signed up for this life of destitute. Then you have convict leasing, et cetera, whatever. But what happens and what comes out of the traditions of Juneteenth is the fact that, like Dr. Miletsky says, so when we think of family reunions, what happened? You know where the master, the enslaver, sold your family to what farm, so you went looking for your family to gather them up. So this is what you normally see for, family reunions. Directly after, when you think about Emancipation Proclamation, because we're talking about the celebrations around freedom, what Freedom Day means for certain people. I know in my family, after New Year's Eve, there was a tradition always where my grandfather, the next day, that morning, all of the grandchildren, every last grand live, whatever, first, second, third grands, we would be sitting in my grandfather's house the whole entire day, whether we want to or not. And it was like that day, you're always with the eldest grandparent in the house, in the family, because that day was a day of blessing and just gathering, because that was the Freedom Day, the day after. And of course, watch night service and this different thing. So when we talk about Freedom Day, which is also the next day, what Juneteenth is also called, is Freedom Day, Jubilee Day. So when you think about what Freedom Day, which is what Juneteenth is also known as, and the nuances of it, these are the traditions, is really of gathering the family back together. When we think of Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Juneteenth, where is your family? Get them back together. That's what, when we think of Juneteenth. So yes, we have the traditions of what is in harvest at that time. So you'll see the strawberry soda, you'll see, the green, wishing you wealth and health. So, you'll see these various traditional food, traditional colors at that time.
Right.
But it really is a gathering of the family in one place, looking for them. Where are they? So, you'll see these various things that happen, but I do think that we cannot leave out the economics and the traditions that came from the holidays, but also the bad things that are still with us, the systematic isms and things that keep us from progressing. And then you see with us on TV, when people talk about, they don't know about structuralism. Oh, you don't know about the structuralism that existed, that came from the system of slavery, that you may or may not have benefited from? Well, it starts there.
Yeah. Put them hands together, because it's not just a great segue to the next question, but it really helps people understand that when we talk about traditions, we talk about holidays, we talk about these things, there's something bigger to it than just a day. These traditions that you talk about, that you just blew my mind talking about strawberry soda and some other things we're talking about. But the aspect of paying homage to your ancestors, to the elders, passing down this tradition, and sometimes, helping the young folk be like, well, why I gotta do this? Like, well, listen, when, eventually you'll be this age, if God blesses you to be this old, and you have to make sure that you keep this lineage, not just in the aspect of physical things, but there's this spiritual passing down of information. This is just these narratives that we kind of talked about in the beginning that are very important, that these traditions, when everything else goes away, this is all you have left. And this is what you should be basing everything that how you define yourself based on how you see yourself within this world. And that's really being connected to these narratives, these stories, these traditions. Watch night service. I was something like, I gotta go to church again on New Year's Eve. And it's like, yeah, because this stuff is rooted. And I remember the preacher always making sure there wasn't just you being here on on New Year's Eve. It was like, it was a reason behind this, and always making sure they put things in context. So I'm thankful for you all just really giving a little bit more depth to what we see as, was it not just Juneteenth, but Jubilee Day. And what was the other term you used? Emancipation.
Freedom Day.
Freedom Day. And so the question that really is really connected to what you're talking about. This aspect of imagery, being able to tell your own story, being able to have ownership of those things. How important is art in this aspect of telling the story right, and providing some of those visualizations that maybe you just can't get out of reading in a book, but once you kind of put this picture or you illuminate it in a different way, now people get it. Now people understand, like, there's this connection between the written word, the oral tradition, as well as this visual representation. So just to go back to your point, because I know you have showed the book, and right on the book was a picture that drew me in. But how important is art?
I think it's so very important and so vital, especially for, the School of Visual Arts, the School of Design, whether you are actually, designing a room, whether you are doing an advertisement, whatever you are doing is so important. A thing, even in historical context, there is a series called Curry and Ives. You can look it up. Curry and Ives have a series. They have Darktown, Darktown series, which makes all these depictions of African Americans. They have a similar series where it's of Irish. You really have to look it up. And sometimes I also point people to look at Gangs of New York, the movie. It's right. It's, we're of a certain generation, so I know we've always seen it, but believe me, you bring it up to a younger generation, they're like, what? They don't have any idea what Gangs in New York is. I think and I love Daniel Day. I think it's such a fabulous movie. I love the costume design. I love the set design. I know a lot of money went into that movie. So, I think about that stuff. But I think the visual arts, because for a lot of us that are any type of diversity that you think of, there's so many movies on Netflix, even when you're thinking about videos, the eye, what do they say? A picture's worth 1,000 words. And for a lot of the, people that have not been in the forefront of history or telling the story or telling the narrative, we haven't had the pen, the camera, or the design to actually tell our story. And so we have to rely on the images that we've seen. We have to rely on the stories that we've been told to kind of create our picture, our image, and not what it looks like from someone else. And so having the opportunity to do that is really very important. There are several artists that have come out of Howard University, and they talk about how, when you're painting a traditional canvas, we're taught to whitewash the canvas. And that's so, like, you get a bare canvas and then you have to actually, wash it down. It's like a really light wash of white, little bit of white, paint and a little bit of water. So you're giving it that first coat, and it's usually white. Well, there's professors at Howard University that teach you the complete opposite when you do it with black paint and water. So it's teaching you from a different perspective. How do you make, what color makes, white, what color makes black? So it's teaching you from a different perspective. And, you have to look at things from a different point of view and not look from traditional framework. When people they look at work from Van Gogh, where did Van Gogh go and paint these pictures? He was in Africa. When you look at various artists, where do they go? So people looking at masters that actually went to Africa. He was, look at Gauguin. Look at where these people were actually doing this work. And so we look at the different narratives of who was doing this work. Now go to music. The people understand that the banjo is actually an African instrument. But where do you hear banjos? People think of country music. The banjo is actually a drum. Look at a banjo next time.
Say,
do you think, when you go ahead.
Say it one more time, because you got kind of chopped up. You said the banjo comes from, if you start from
the banjo is an actual African instrument. It comes from an African drum. If you look at it, it's cut off from an African drum. So a lot of the music that you would hear, bluegrass, look at the chords that you hear from bluegrass and country music. It is actually coming from African music. So when we really pull back the layers of a lot of American culture, and it's really coming from African American history in the mixture of what was created that we were a part of. So you have to really look at it from a lens of what was created, especially jazz music. So it has to be something that is inclusive, and you have to be innately open to allowing the creative expressions of everyone, and not just purely looking at the masters from a European perspective of what was traditionally done. And this has been done to many people who have been in art school. And so really understanding how to incorporate more than just one master of the arts. Look at design. Look at what's happened to, as we know, Dapper Dan back in the days. Okay.
Yeah, break down
what
Dapper
he was
Dan,
doing.
'cause once again, that's an old school situation. Yeah, that you get some context there.
Yeah, but Dr. Miletsky, he's a hip hop person. He needs to talk about Dapper Dan. Come on.
Just did a
He
deal
was,
with. Just got the deal. He's not. He's not old school anymore. He's in the news a lot now.
He's not only old school, he's corporate now. This man, any rap video from the 90s, he dressed all of the hip hop people, the hottest stuff, and got sued, right? But now we're talking about economics, right? And now tell him about the deal, Dr. Miletsky.
Well, the deal's how you feel. If you I mean, the thing is, he had a vision and saw something that the big time industry giants didn't understand or see. Not only did they not see it, as we may recall in the 90s, a lot of the big fashion houses and stuff, especially like Tommy Hilfiger or Polo or different ones, were ambivalent about like Black folk, or at least hip hop folk, representing their label, their clothing, and sense of, there was this actual like complete, not only like a missing out on a $1 billion opportunity, but also all because of having their noses up in the air, in a sense of not, of wanting to like, separate their fashion for certain people and not something in the street. But then comes the, so as Dr. Key said, he got sued, he was making those jackets, the jacket that paid in full, when they had the album cover, the Gucci jacket, these custom made, a whole Louis Vuitton suit. You know what I'm saying? Like, this was an idea that Gucci and Louis Vuitton and those people never even thought of.
Right.
Right. So yeah. That's and it is nice.
But it really goes to the fact that it was like you're not allowing people, like we wanted to dress a certain way. So it's like, how do you reach all of the markets, but include people in a way that was representative of how they wanted to look? Like, see, this is this, like when we're talking about design, we're talking about visual arts, we're talking about representing on a level of how people want to look inclusive. So that was the thing. Like you said, they were missing a whole market. Not that we're advertising to plagiarize or steal design. No, we're not advertising that. But we're saying, look how you will be missing out on a whole level of people. And it wasn't just, Black kids and brown kids. It was everybody that wanted this look because it was cool, it was hip. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion of people.
And I'm thinking about the entrepreneurial and the creative mind coming together. The fact that he realized, like, wait a minute, I don't have to go to Gucci to get the material. I can go up to Fifth Ave, and get a material straight from, Fashion Avenue, get that stuff off the roll. That will be a lot less expensive, but then put my own design to it. Now we're talking about patents and really being able to kind of not just create your own image or style. You created, it's part of an upcoming culture now too with hip hop. Now it's like, once again, there's this ownership of image, is ownership of design, is ownership of voice, is ownership of style, and to know that you get sued for that in a place where it's supposed to be more liberated or more freedom to have that creative expression, is really interesting. Once again, that we're talking about, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, no. It's really just like the journey of hip hop itself. It's the clash of uptown meets downtown, downtown meets uptown, right? Culture, in a sense, like hip hop doesn't become big until it hits the clubs and stuff downtown. Some of the punk rock clubs were the first places to allow it to happen.
Right.
And so there's like a clash almost, but it's not a clash. It's only a clash if you trying to. It's like create that color line again. Like growing up, I ignorantly used to think of like rock and roll kind of music as white music, and we didn't. It all depends on your age, and generation. But we didn't, at least, we didn't want. We were like rejecting that. We were like, no, we like hip hop, not realizing.
So connected.
As he said, rock and roll is Black music. Not knowing about the '50s chess records, I didn't know any of that stuff. Right. They didn't know
both forms of music were rejected by who? The older generation that thought everybody was going to hell.
Right. Well,
so they come together against the older people.
It's a lot of things going on, but what it comes down to is we're taught, if you come out of South Bronx or you come out of Harlem or Uptown or I don't know, other spaces, that anything you come from the gutter, you don't have anything to contribute. Street culture doesn't have anything of value or of worth, except to, you could easily say, oh, just rip off, trying to be like rich folks and stuff. But poverty is the mother of invention. Like, as you would say, talking about visual art. Listen, nobody understands how to make something out of nothing, make a way out of no way, and just put something together so well with Scotch tape and whatever's around, that then make the people who created it want it. And that's what happens. That's what has happened. And that has been an income generator. It's been an economic shot in the arm for the Black communities in which some of the most beautiful, most desirable, most popular, and most profitable art comes from.
Right.
So there's record promoters and people in the music industry. There's a reason they used to drive through the ghettos and try to recruit, because the diamonds in the rough is there. Right? The place they tell you they got nothing is where it's all at.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing if you, like you said, go back to slavery times, or even when there was fields. If you look at that movie you brought up, Cadillac Records, when you go back, they were in the fields taping those guys on those guitars, only on those guitars, and you can find them old records and hearing them sing those field songs on those guitars. You talking about art? Guess what? You can go back and find folklore art that sells for crazy amount of money. You can find quilts that sell for crazy amount of money. Let's talk about street food. You can go try to buy some hog maws now. Okay, go try to find some what's the stuff they put in there, the chicken, what is it, the turkey necks and all that stuff they put in the food now.
Right.
And then don't talk about street art, the graffiti and different things now. Go try to find that stuff. And it was the poorest stuff. It was the stuff that they threw away that people made a way out of no way. And it's the same thing with hip hop. Think about when they started turntables. Go to the movies and you see where they actually were stealing electricity to start the parties. That they would break dancing and the radio. It was something out of nothing that became a commodity to corporate. And they were able to polish it up and sell it, that you see it became popular. So we know where design and stuff came from. The only problem is that we were able to lose our voice in the creativity part of it, because now they have to commodify it. Right. And then one thing I will caution about our art form is that we can't allow them to paint this one picture, because we do see that, because then everybody calls bees, hoes, pimps, and everything else that's
right.
Yeah, it's a street. It's really the creation of northern. We used to call them ghettos, and then the code word inner city. Like we don't know where the inner city. That's Manhattan. That's downtown, right? But when people say inner city, they're talking about who we're talking about. So all that kind of stuff, like the division and trying to keep these kinds of lines. That's a game that's been going on, and you're absolutely right. That is the challenge. Our creativity and our genius and our brilliance for bringing a vision, an alternative vision into the world, whether it be through music, whether it be through art, whether it's visual art, the Harlem Renaissance, sculpting, everything, poetry, like America has America was like into European culture. It's European descended in a lot of ways in terms of culture, and that's what they're listening to Bach and Brahms and all that stuff. And then here comes like Scott Joplin with ragtime. They had never heard anything like it. And then people from Europe come over here. They're like, oh, dude, we got Bach and Brahms over here. They're like, I don't want to hear that. I want to go hear the ragtime, Scott Joplin's rags and Bessie Smith's blues. You know what I mean? I want to hear about the Blue Note thing. There's something powerful there that comes out of oppression. It comes out of all the things that oh man. And somebody said no shame in being Black, but it's mighty inconvenient at times. That place of being creates some powerful stuff. But then we have to own our own narrative. That was something that we had talked about in the past, and that's why you got to look at like models like that, like Spike Lee, or in terms of film at least, Robert Townsend. Remember Hollywood Shuffle?
Hollywood Shuffle, yeah.
Telling the story through art, things you can say through art that you cannot say in other venues, things you can say through comedy that you can't say, a chance to tell what the real deal is.
Yeah, respect.
And when you bring up Townsend, that's such a powerful model. When I see how he had to go buy all the little B-rolls and put that together, whenever I hear that story, it's so amazing to hear that story, and he made it work. But how many people know that and have the creativity to do that? And I think that's what is really important, like you say, ownership of it. Because when we don't have ownership, we also lose creativity on, the final say of what's going to happen.
Right.
But I do think the medium that we're using now is leveling the playing field, because people are able to use, it's great to have the top level, the big people who, are on TV and the networks to, that usually is the standard. But I think now where we are now, people are using the internet and other platforms to get their word out, because previously our voices were not being heard on the larger platforms. So I think I do see a change in that there are people that are using the internet and other various platforms to get their voices out. And I think that's a change. I see other people, I don't know if we can say names of rappers and stuff, but I see them buying big time art sales. I don't know if you see it. I don't know if we want to say names here, but I see a rapper that's buying major art. Like this is major deal.
So you can say, sorry.
Well, Jay-Z. He's buying, major art that never happened before. Yeah. And that's great.
Yeah. I was going to say, there's oh my gosh, I forgot the name of the movie, but one of our professors did something with HBO with the Black art. And he talked about Swiss Beats and Alicia Keys having shows in their house when they buy certain piece of Black art to make sure people not just see it, but as also people to also be in a place to have them purchase the art while they're in their house as well. And I think they talked about the fact that there's always been a love of art, but now that they're in this position to be more of an enterprise and to be more of an owner of not just their art but others, it's like this connection that they're having with these Black artists in ways that they couldn't have before. So it's like this elevation through the arts, through hip hop, through making the music, but also this imagery that we tend not to have ownership of. I think this is something that is definitely on the rise up. So you can say artists. I don't think we're
yeah, well, because I do think it's important because, for many people who are of color, I don't believe that, from a perspective from the home, that we believe that this is something that we can do for a profession. I know at least, and I don't think it was a place from, that it was from a place of love, that they don't want you to starve.
Right.
They want you to be able to have a livelihood. And they don't know if it's sustainable, unfortunately. And that's where it comes from,
Yeah, that comes up in conversation a lot. The decision one to go to art school, but then when you're in art school, having to battle these outside entities that are telling you, well, you sure you want to do this? You gonna get a job? How you gonna sustain yourself, and not realizing that there's all these different opportunities within the realm of art that you could be doing your main, let's say, art discipline, but then there's these other skill sets that come along with you to be successful in there as well. Not even understanding the aspect of being an entrepreneur, that hey, I could be my own boss, and just auto sale of maybe one or two or three of my pieces. That's the salary for the year, and to change that narrative, I think is going to be key as well. And I think having conversations like the ones we're having, exposing more of these things out there, so people can see that there are these options that people may not have known about before. Yeah.
And I think today the time that we're living in is completely different. Right. I've seen on TV, with these electronic, devices and drawing electronically is completely out of my world. Right. And this digital world that we're in. So, I mean, I really think that if that's a skill set that they're able to get, because look what, the world that we're in, I think digital art as well as, having a physical piece is really going to be important, because everybody's on social media. Mm-hmm. Everybody has, these videos, these, Instagram, or God knows what other platform is going to come up in the next couple of years. And being transitional from platform to the physical realm for advertising, Dr. Miletsky has a book coming up, who did his cover work. You usually have a platform that goes along with his book, who designs that. And then, and a lot of times, like I was saying before, when we are working in this field, the historic realm that we're working in, sometimes we have images and sometimes we don't. I have historical images, half of the face is gone. I need it to be reconstructed. How does that work? Wow. I'm working in a historic home. And I have the narrative of a picture of how the house looked. Do I have a designer that can help me make the replica of this house, or even a furniture maker that can help me redesign this house? So those are all of the things that I think the world of the arts could really help us in our profession, and has in the past. So I do think that this is a viable field for people to be in. I know sometimes it could be hard, but we do need this field to survive and to inform one another.
That was great. Thank you, Dr. Grier-Key. And Dr. Miletsky, I know you wanted to interject on some things. Or
yeah, I'll probably just kind of make final things, but yeah. But just going back to, I think I absolutely agree. Considering the things that we spoke about in this conversation and earlier on in the conversation, especially in terms of like lack of opportunities, lack of, ability to gain, employment or gainful employment, besides entrepreneurship and then other activities that may not, that may be other, in other areas, what else are people left with, but to strike out on their own? Capitalism is not necessarily going anywhere, and that's not likely to change. But if you have after slavery vagrancy laws and all these different things, as we were saying, what it comes down to is warehousing people. If there's nowhere in the economy, remember, for every individual in the economy, that's a salary, benefits for them, for their children and their families, parking spot, office space. You know, there's not, you know, instead what we've had is a dialogue of scarcity. There's not enough room for everybody. So when you bring in Black folks, you know, for the first time, I talk about in my book in 1963 when Black families were asking questions about the Boston public schools, there was like 12 Black teachers in the entire system, no Black principals whatsoever, and so how can you learn in that kind of an environment? But yet an unwillingness to hire Black folks in those positions, even though the population of Black people in the system was like about 30% or something like that. And so we've had all these kinds of like issues. You know, I go back, you guys were talking about Jay-Z, you know, remember Jay-Z's like, you know, I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman, you know, a businessman, you know, so it's that's key. That's key. You have to, if jobs are made available, what you got is basically the underground economy, so-called illegal activities, and so on and so what. Well, they're not so-called; they are illegal. But if there's no way to survive in the urban ghettos or neighborhoods, especially the North and other places, in terms of gainful employment, then what are you left with but entrepreneurship? You know, you really have to. This is vital. This is actually vital, and I really like Jay-Z. I kind of messed up that line, but I like
It's all hip hop. It's all hip hop. Yeah.
Hip hop. But I'll do a different one. You know, what's better than one Black billionaire? You know, 3 or whatever. So or 2. So you know, they're right about that. You know, and I think it's important to. I know we were asking, should we name names? It's a good question. Why? Because some people have had criticism of somebody like a Jay-Z, you know, for being involved with certain projects, or, you know, you shouldn't be doing those kinds of, what are you doing dealing in art and all that kind of stuff, you know, how is that helping the Black community? And there's been a lot of debate with regard to our brother Jay-Z, who's just an enormous talent, visionary, and an entrepreneurial model, got out of Marcy Project, you know, and created a business, man, and was friends with Obama. Like, don't believe the hype. Just because somebody's an entertainer, all right, and putting out music that you love and can't stop listening to, that's his job. That's what he does. That's the art he creates that we love. But that doesn't mean or define just him as a person or an individual and what he can do. Don't put hip hop in a box. You already made that mistake. Don't want to keep doing that because this is a possible point of leadership. It's not just a possible one. It is one. An important model for moving forward. So for the students and the faculty, school visual arts, you know, that's the model, and it comes a different question for Black folks because it really comes down to survival.
Man. Yeah. But I think it also talks to 2 types of Americas too, and I think they tend to come around. And, you know, I know to W.E.B. Du Bois talking about the duality and dual consciousness, but also having this dual existence in America, which leads me to kind of my next question about how is Juneteenth connected to things like Tulsa, Oklahoma, that they just recognize via the president, but now I would say not to be the president, but those 3 ancestors left from Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, the Voting Rights Act that has always seemed like it's always up in arms about, you know, either being legitimized by certain groups, and it's like whenever it benefits one or the other, that's when it goes another way. But being that it benefited certain individuals being in office right now other folks are trying to revisit it and change it per state so it benefits another group. So another type of politician comes through. And I would say even to Black Lives Matter, how would you see that, or how would you say, or how would you kind of connect what happened with Juneteenth, all the things that came out of Juneteenth? How is this connected to what happened in Tulsa, what happened in Rosewood, what's happening with the voting rights, and also just the continual fight with Black Lives Matter?
Yeah. Well, Dr. Grier-Key, reference this a little bit. We do have to look to the words of our leaders and past leaders to understand a lot of this, because they have the bird's eye view. Frederick Douglass made a remark about the end of slavery. It's basically, okay, the black people are free, but free to do what? Free to starve, free to not have work, free to, kind of paraphrase. But he goes on, and that was kind of the issue. How are, this major change about, which is now going to make America a place that's like what they called at that time a biracial democracy, Black and white. They're turning away from the idea that Black folks are going to leave, go away, or Black folks weren't going anywhere, not from a place that they had literally, their blood, sweat, tears in that land, and in many cases, and just so many different things, the long march to freedom. And so, that means employment, that means schooling, that means, all the needs and so forth that need to be taken care of. And what you find is in various states, a lot of pushback to that kind of thing, an unwillingness to make room in the American economy for the freedmen, as they called it then, folks who had been enslaved, or Black folk in general, right? By that point, and so all kinds of competition, around jobs. I had alluded to, one of the problems that most people know nowadays with the 13th Amendment, because it was this amazing documentary that came out called 13th by Ava DuVernay that a lot of people saw, that explained pretty well, what the problem with the 13th Amendment was. And it has that clause in it, except for, that basically says slavery in America is ended, wherefore, except, for the, someone who has committed a crime. And what we see right after slavery is a massive buildup, as Dr. Grier-Key was already saying, a massive buildup in terms of mass incarceration, the building of jails, and just ridiculous amount of African Americans in particular being arrested for things like so-called vagrancy, or so-called loitering, which really comes down to basically not being employed. That's pretty much what that crime is. So so this all comes down to economics, as she was saying, and not all of it, but certainly a big piece of it. And it just has to do with kind of limiting the scope and the rights, especially in the former Confederate states. I have to emphasize that. In the formerly Confederate states is where we see this the most. And that includes Texas, of course, which is also seceded from the Union, I believe, in 1861. But remember, Texas had only been a state for 14 years or 15 years by that point. So there you see a curtailing in terms of, the ability to move about, the ability to be free. Remember the Green Book, which comes later, but the Green Book, something passed to the, from hand to hand to folks, as a way to know where to travel, because, even if you're not in a formerly Confederate state, If you're traveling even in the North, you know, there was all kinds of discrimination and prejudice, and also in various more hidden ways, ways of curtailing the movement of African American folks. So that's kind of like I think part of what's going on there. But again, follow that trail of, in terms of economics, the widening of capitalism in what was supposed to be the richest country in the world, made rich, ironically enough, by the exploitation of unpaid labor called slavery. So you really have to talk about a Du Boisian dilemma. Yeah, you got you have a dilemma of enormous and gigantic proportions. So again, looking to the words of the leadership at the time, who can tell us today in the present what people might have been thinking, what they might have been feeling. Again, to go back to Frederick Douglass and Dr. Grier-Key mentioned this already. Frederick Douglass's famous, you know, what to the slave is the 4th of July. You know, a speech, by the way, he gave on the 5th of July to make the point that being American for Black folk is complicated, to say the least. And on a day to celebrate American independence, it puts people in a feeling of contemplation. I believe, you know, you have to really think about some of that. And so that's that double consciousness right there. And Douglass saying this well before Du Bois, right? Understood that as well. And so, again, we're talking again about holidays. You know, if July 4th was a problem for Frederick Douglass, and it's been a problem, not a problem, but a dilemma, let's say, a dilemma, like you put it, I'll use your word. Then a thing like Juneteenth comes around as a holiday that I think a lot of folks can maybe get behind. And, you know, and in that, imperfect as it may be, celebrate what it means to be American, to be Black American, what it, you know, the complications therein.
I'd like to add though, but at the same time, you know, most folks don't know that, you know, even though Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order, he also was for, you know, displacing a whole bunch of American-born African Americans at that time. And he dabbled with, you know, colonization and wanting to send them over to Haiti. And, you know, basically with taxpayer money that was bamboozled, and there was a whole story behind that you can look up. And to that too, you know, Douglass and Du Bois and a whole bunch of people said, no, we're American. We were born here. We don't want to be displaced and go anywhere else. So I do feel that there is also a move of people who also out of character, out of context, and out of content do quote, you know, misquote what to a slave is, you know, July 4th. Because now what to a slave, but if you're not slave, then what do we now allow somebody to claim a flag that also end land that belongs to us? Because without the colored soldier, the American Revolution would not have been won. And who was the first person to take a shot for the American Revolution? You're from Boston, so you know it's Christopher Adams. He's the first person to have taken a shot for the American Revolution. So without the Black man, we wouldn't have been in the war. And then we know that the colored soldiers were the first couple of lines that were sent out for the American Revolution. So we have to have credit there too. And personally, from a family that has someone who fought in every war of this country. I refuse to let people steal a flag that belongs to me and ancestors that have shed blood in every war of this country and that built it from enslaved hands to steal this country as well. When Marian Anderson sang on those steps, it was a reminder to let them know that this country has to live up to its liberties that is promised to us as well. So I'm going to celebrate Juneteenth and July 4th because that it belongs to me as well. And so when I say that we've always had a dual calendar, and as Dr. Jarvis has said, we have a duality. And we are going to make sure, certain of us, want to make sure that you are going to live up to your promises, and our ancestors that have marched on those bridges and have lost their lives for the right for us to vote, and for the right of our existence, because we are like the dreamers, the involuntary immigrants that were born here against our will. We didn't come in the dark of the night. We were involuntary born here. And for that matter, the enslaved Africans are the only, just like the dreamers, involuntary, okay? And for that matter, the enslaved Africans are the only involuntary ones that were brought here in chains. And so we are owed a debt. We were never paid reparations. There wasn't a truth and reconciliation for us. And for that reason, I do think that this conversation and discourse, although you hear people talking about there shouldn't be a conversation of critical race theory and all of this stuff, which they don't know what it means. And we're having this conversation about Juneteenth, which is really supposed to be, it's not just merely a celebration, but at least there's a ending of some type of celebration. And people don't even know about that. And we don't want to have a real conversation about the true history of this country. I think that the time is now.
Absolutely.
Man, yes. Amen to that. And I like the fact that you talked about the fact that being that you have ancestors who fought in all wars. And I think sometimes it's, to some extent, there was this aspect of, if you fight in a war, then this is something that will give you the freedom that you're looking for. But even looking at World War II, when individuals came home, they realized that wasn't the case, and then right here in Long Island, when we talk about Levittown and Roosevelt and all the different small towns that separate, those who are privileged based off of race, and I was an even gender as well, how towns were formed based off of that. But still, we still, celebrate 4th of July because we feel like, once again, even though we were brought here involuntarily, this is our country. Even though we fought in these wars and we're still not getting the respect, this is our country, and having to battle and go back and forth between those consciousness is really a text I don't think a lot of people really understand that comes along with this. So celebrating Juneteenth, really understanding what liberation means, what it means to be liberated. It's not something that comes from without, it's something that definitely comes from within. So you, inside your mind, you realize you're free, but you're just fighting against these systems that are preventing you from doing that, So it's, I know I've probably said a lot right there, just trying to summarize some of the things we talked about thus far, but it's I think to Dr. Miletsky, this is complicated, I think you're breaking it down.
It is, but if I could just tie that into Tulsa, when you think about Tulsa, that's one of the things why they were so self-sufficient. Many of them were, veterans, and, they walked around with their rifles out. So they knew the gentlemen that came there wrongfully, they saw their rifles and they were intimidated that they were, they came home with their service rifles, and that was part of it. When you're a soldier and you come home with your rifle, because the whole expectancy is that, God forbid, if there's a war on the territory, you're able to rise up from your home and, defend your country, your honor. And so these servicemen from Tulsa, they had their service, weapons, and they were able to defend their property. So that was another part that had to do with Tulsa. And it's really a shame that when you think about Tulsa, that's the legacy that's left there. And so when you think about design, and you can't really see my book because it's, we had an exhibit out east with an artist who, is reconfiguring some from the oral history and the stories, some of the images from, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I'll send over some information, but that's the oral history that we're able to use to try, because everything was burnt down to the ground. I know the museum in Washington, they have an exhibit in its pennies, because there was one of the ancestors, that's all she would see was the pennies, because everything was burnt down to the ground, but the pennies lasted. So how do you tell a story of something that's just like gone? There's nothing left, So it was really an amazing experience to, go to the museum when it was first created. I was there before it was open, because we have some of our images from Eastville in the museum. And I met a lot of people who contributed to the museum. And that story particularly stuck with me. And some of the World War I veterans who had like this, medal from France, because they wouldn't give the African-American soldiers the Purple Heart. So they gave them this medal from France. It's like called the Coupe de Coeur or something like that. It's the medal from France. And so she donated that to the museum as well. So meeting the curator for the military exhibit in the museum in Washington. So it was all of these different things, and people had things in their homes that they donated to. So a lot of oral history, a lot of individuals and African Americans having things in their attics that they didn't think was valuable, because, what did we do after all? Or, they didn't think it was valuable. I mean, how many of you have grown up and seen in your houses from the 60s and 70s, these velvet, images, just think about that. So some of the artwork and designs that we've seen that we didn't really think had value is now what we're looking at for art and design to tell our stories and reshape our images. So I think that's important in the narrative on how we represent who we are and tell our story. And so I'm happy to see that there's more and more of these conversations that we're having right now to inform artists that they don't have to look at the narrative from a historical, a historic presence from Europe that really doesn't represent our culture. Because that's really hard to do.
Actually, I'm gonna pause because I think somebody's at my door. But the next question is going to be you extending that aspect of why is art so important, and telling the story about Juneteenth and other historical events that we may or may not know because of just the suppression of what history is designed to do. Is, for those who are the victors, you have the spoils. But now that we have art, and we have a little bit more, I think more young people who are aware, and a lot of us who are telling these stories, maybe to our young folk, how important is art. Let me just figure out what's happening at the front door. I'll be right back. And the question was, how is Juneteenth connected to other African American Black historical events such as Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, voting rights, and Black Lives Matter?
It was kind of interesting. Dr. Grier-Key was talking about Christmas Attic and fighting men, men who fought in American wars, right? We talk about that often, and it's the symbolism of it is striking. The idea of serving a country that's not necessarily serving you back, but time and time again, no matter what the debate was, I agree that the notion of fighting for this country and not letting anyone tell Black folks, not letting anyone tell them that they were not American, or that they were less American, or that they were not somehow part of America, is important. That's a very important thing to note. And this is where genealogy is also a great thing too, and it's something that's been coming up a lot currently. I've been working on like my family background stuff for a while. Coming from like a racially mixed background, and then on my mother's side, my African American forebears and roots, which also go back to the Caribbean. But finding out things like who fought in the American Revolution, if one has an ancestor that fought in the American Revolution, there's all kinds of organizations and groups today. You alluded to this. I think. I thought of it. I'll say when you mentioned Marian Anderson, singing, being told that she could not, perform. Famous opera singer, black opera singer. That's a history that's really important to connect, for folks to connect with. And so, my goal was to go back as far at least to find out where my enslaved ancestors were. I knew they were in North Carolina, but specifically, and I've been getting closer and closer to finding this out. But along the way, finding out things like who fought in what war and who, was involved in. And as she pointed out, first to fall, Crispus Attucks, who was what we would actually call today biracial, or mulatto, is that how he was referred to at the time. A black man, to be sure. He was a tall man, turns out, and quite a large guy, who basically picks a fight with the British troops in a bar in Boston. And that is how the Boston Massacre basically happened. That is what took place. All of my books before busing, which I don't have a picture of today, but I do talk about this as you have to, because that is a key part of our story. Prince Hall, his son Primus Hall, the family, and that was the other thing Dr. He mentioned was family. The theme this year for Black History Month, let us not forget, was and is still the Black family. And so it all kind of fits together, like this thing, focus on Juneteenth, focus on family, has taken on greater significance, especially in the last few years, because of all the racial injustice and the different things that have been happening. It's heightened people's awareness about issues like this. I think in the past several decades, I don't know too many. Listen, I've been to plenty of barbecues and cookouts on July 4th, and it was all kind of folks there, right? This is something that people, will continue to celebrate. And I like that idea of celebrating both, as you said. We can celebrate both. And there's all kinds of powerful traditions that go together with both of those holidays. And it's important. It's important to emphasize both.
Yeah. I like that aspect of being able to know that you can celebrate both and still keep your head high, but you have ownership over those traditions that come along with that. And I think it's going to be different based off the region that you are currently in, but the significance of the fact that you remembering and holding on to your story in a way that gives strength, gives I gotta say vitality, and gives that lineage that much more significance of why certain traditions are done, certain ways of life are preserved, the way you go about doing business with other folk is part of that tradition as well. And there's certain times of the year that you just you're not going to be available because you're getting ready for, or you're involved in, so don't call me on this particular day, don't reach out to me, please come. If it's about work, we're not going to do that. But if it's about tradition and heritage, allow be a part of this experience, but understand that this is something that we hold very high, and something that can't be I would say adulterated by by the outside, so to speak, and all these other forces that tend to press upon you being liberated, whether it be physically or mentally, definitely spiritually. So, but I didn't know that about Crispus Attucks also, the other, that like his I guess genetic makeup as well as his size. I'm always thinking about the one picture where he's just kind of like some individual's heads going back after being shot, but not knowing all these other aspects of who Crispus Attucks was. I think that's another kind of part to what we need to talk about. And to one of my former questions, I think that Dr. Grier was getting to is how.
But before we go there, I just like to interject. Definitely, I know of his indigenous background, but you also know that one drop rule, which was definitely snuck in there. You have that one drop of that African blood. You know what happens when what they say there. But also, let's not forget about the women who fought in the Civil War, because Harriet Tubman should be included. Okay, we can't forget about that. I may be outnumbered here on this Zoom, but let's not forget about Harriet Tubman, who was a spy and definitely led, should be given a higher title in some respect, because without her, they wouldn't have been able to navigate, the waters to be led to the victory in the end.
Great.
So Harriet Tubman needs to be given much respect and much due in the fight for the Civil War, and more than just being put on the dollar bill. So she needs to definitely be added to the books in regards to the Civil War, because as I said, not just the soldiers who were on the front line,
right.
She was a navigator of the seas for the Civil War and through the woods. So I think that's really important to add. So, I often get a little honorary sometimes when people question my American hoodness, because I know that a lot of times when you think about, it changes, many times, and you guys know this, people question when people became white, because Irish and Italian and many others were not considered white. They assimilated because there's no melanin in their skin, and they are able to be now called white. But also, even now, some other people are now allowed to be checking the box white now on the census. There's new studies of this, because now the country is browning. So you have people who are nowhere near the consideration of white, but they're being forced to check this box because there's nothing else. People of various other descents from Middle East, so there's this new move to change and assimilate to this new white that we see happening in the country. So I think that this is something that we're going to have to talk about in the future, but I just wanted to add that.
No, that's a great point that you're making, because there tends to be this centering of whiteness in a lot of things that we do, especially in the aspect of art. And where I work at School of Visual Arts, that's something that we're addressing in regards to creating more inclusive pedagogy, more inclusive curriculums, to make sure that there's this total story that's being told and shared and visualized by not just students, but also those who are in the classrooms that teach. And I just want to thank the both of you for being here today. And I know, like I said, I know you all have other things you got to get to in the next few minutes or so, but I just want to make sure that on behalf of the School of Visual Arts, on behalf of the Diversity Office, or Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, that we just really give our heartfelt thanks for your time and your wisdom and the knowledge that you shared today. And like I said, hopefully that it reaches and continues to reach those as we kind of spread the word through our YouTube channel and through all the different social media outlets. But most importantly, that you plant a seed in the people who are watching this to help inspire them to know more about Juneteenth, but know more about themselves, know more about their heritage, but also with this aspect of them knowing about the fact that they can invest in their future and be all that they can be. Right. But on that just want to say thank you for watching. We'll be sending this out pretty soon, and be safe. And hopefully you enjoyed your Juneteenth. And we'll look for the next conversation. Please come back and for further conversations. Everyone, have a great day, and talk to you soon. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.